Okay, so coming on board. And as I said, I think what we will do is we're going to start with the poll in just a second, but let me introduce myself. Some of you have known me for many years, and some of you have known me for less time. And there's a couple of people here who are going through the program with me, and we have a couple of people who have studied and have done the training to be mentors under our program at the Centre for Western Mindfulness. But that's only like 4 of you. The rest of you are people from, we've got people here from South Australia, Tasmania, Western Australia, and various places in Queensland. So it's really lovely to have that diversity of people joining us tonight. I'm a Queensland boy, Dalby boy, originally born and raised in rural Queensland, and got involved in natural therapies at a very young age, and went on to study a whole variety of natural therapies, which I ended up having as a practice in Dalby when I went back to Dalby eventually. And so some of these people that are here have been to me as clients in my previous incarnation as a healer. One of the things that happened for me in that is, in working with people and the way I work with people, I realised that one of the biggest issues that we deal with in terms of our health is the gap between the head and the heart. And that many times a lot of the stuff that I was dealing with people had a lot to do with what was going on in that space between head and heart space. And so my journey then took me into studying attitudinal healing, which was a form of A Course in Miracles in the late 80s. And for many years ran a attitudinal healing group in Dalby as an adjunct to my practice. And my journey's taken me all sorts of places since then, but there's always been a commitment to living life with a commitment to mindfulness as a way of life. And so that's ultimately how I've ended up here. And so tonight I want to share with you just some of what I think are the really key elements around awareness and spiritual awareness. And hopefully some of it may have some interest to you, and you get to see the sort of work that I do and the breadth of what I do. I think right from the outset, what I want to really have clear is that what I have to offer is the information that is needed for you to have a life that is primarily happy. It's about having happiness as a way of life, as opposed to something that happens from time to time. And basically, what the work that I do is help people move to that place where happiness becomes the core sense of who you are. And when I look at what's happening in the world right now, I think that sense of happiness is something that there's an absolute shortage of. And if we could bottle it and sell it, it would be probably the number one medicine in the world right now. And so if there's anything that my work's about, it's about being able to have you find a way, or anyone that I get to work with, have them find a very sustainable way to have happiness as an ongoing experience. I want to talk a little bit before we start about the essence of who we are. And we're going to be talking about this in terms of consciousness a little bit later on, in terms of how the human mind works. But I want to propose the idea that what sits here, me and each of you, is a combination of two things. One, a human being who has all of the taste, touch, sight, smell, sound, all those things that are what we experience in our human being. But also what sits here is what I call, the words I use, is a soul being. And they're two very distinct things. in the explanation that I have around this is that our soul being is that part of us that is eternal, if that's what you want to call it. And the human being, as most of us are familiar, tends to have a very limited time frame. And so what we've got is this situation where we get to experience life either through who we are as a human being or who we are as a soul being, and of course, and a combination of those things. For the majority of us, our experience is as a human being. And the evidence of that is that for most of us, we experience life in a challenging way for the majority of the time. You know, people are struggling a lot, and when we're in a place of struggling, we're in a place of our human being. In other words, it's got to do with the way in which the mind is engaged. So what we've got is this human being that has all of this stuff going on, that interprets experience through basically sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. Then we have our soul being that only knows happiness. The state of the soul in its natural state is one of joy, peace, and love, which are different facets of the state of happiness. And so what I can suggest to you is that those moments where you are sitting in a joyful place, in a peaceful place, in a loving place, there's a very good chance that at that place you're connecting with your soul being. And anything other than that, you're connecting with your human being. And a guy by the name of Rupert Spira uses a lovely analogy of the idea that if you use the sky as a metaphor for this, the blue of the sky is its natural state. That's its core, what the sky is. And during the daytime, it's blue, and you've got this beautiful blue sky. He equates that to our soul being. And then he says what we have are these clouds. And for some of us, it's actually a stormy, raining, fully enmeshed, where there's no blue sky of any kind, clouds, which represents who we are in our human being. Some of us have even thunderstorms and all sorts of things going on within our human being state. And because we identified that as our reality, what happens is when the clouds do part a little bit and we see a little bit of blue, we kind of think that it's the cloud. That little bit of happiness that we have for a moment is a fleeting cloud that passes across our experience. And the rest of the time, what we're experiencing is clouds. And we perceive that that's what our reality is. As we go through the process of becoming more aware, and as we develop the capacity to be the observer and be that which is present, what happens is those clouds start to dissipate and we begin to realize that there's more blue. And ideally, with the passage of time, what we end up with is the occasional cloud that crosses our blue sky. And I think it's a really lovely metaphor for exploring this notion of the difference between who we are as our soul being and who we are in our human being. And basically, the work that I do is about helping people make that transition from the degree to which they spend their time in either soul beingness or in human beingness. and that the natural result of spending more time in your soul beingness is that you get to experience life as a more joyful, peaceful, loving experience. And the more that we spend time in our human consciousness, we get to have that generally as being challenging and difficult times. And so some of the things that we saw there is that in that poll that we did earlier on, two of the things that really stood out in terms of what people wanted was better quality relationships and having more peace, love, and joy as a way of life. And so in theory, what I'm talking about tonight, what I have to offer, is all about how to create those things as a way of life, as a way of being. All right. In the Greek Orthodox tradition, I don't know if many of you have had much to do with that at all, they had a concept called theosis. And theosis was the idea of being at one with God. It sort of talked about the idea that it was possible to get to that place where you could be like God or be at one with God. That was called theosis. But theosis had 3 steps to it, and this is quite significant in any spiritual journey, and it's not restricted just to a Eastern Orthodox approach. And the process of theosis was, first of all, going through a process of purification. The second part of the process was illumination. And then the third part of the process was what was called unification. And purification as a process basically was the process of shifting consciousness from who we are in our human beingness to becoming more aligned with our consciousness in our soul beingness. And that was the purification process. What was interesting was that a phrase was developed by I think he was a 15th century Spanish mystic monk by the name of John of the Cross. And he came up with the phrase dark night of the soul. And he talked about the idea that you had to go through a dark night experience, which is this purification. So the process of purification was effectively a dark night experience. And what I became aware of in the work that I was researching and the books that I ended up writing about was the whole notion that this could actually be a very clearly laid out step-by-step process that you could be guided through. That it was possible to have somebody walk through with you through this dark night experience. Invariably, what happens is when we have our dark night of the soul, 3 things in particular really help to impact those things. And all of you, I'm sure, have experienced these at one time or another. The first one is natural justice. When I lived in Italy, they had these huge, like a donut bun thing called bumbas. That was the name of them. And its name means big bottom. And so the natural justice was actually inscribed into the name of the actual food. If you ate too many of these, you'd get a big bottom. That's natural justice. You know, right now we have an epidemic of, globally, but certainly in the Western world, of diabetes. You know, nobody's punishing people with diabetes. It's natural justice. It's the consequence of people making choices around lifestyle that's responsible for that. So what we have is things happen to us that are the consequence of natural justice. Nobody's dishing it out to us. It's just the natural consequence of the choices that we make. I'm sure all of you have had that happen once or twice in your life experience. The second one is old man time, the impact of aging. And I see some of you might know old man time intimately, in terms of the way in which all of a sudden our quality of life is being impacted by the way in which getting old affects who we are physically and mentally. And I've just gone through the process of my mum just passed away late last year at 90, nearly 92. But just watching the deterioration of a woman who spent her whole life involved in pursuing natural therapies and living a life that was oriented towards being very conscious around who she was spiritually as well as physically. And yet she couldn't stop the impact of old man time and the way it was having its impact on her experience and causing her to suffer and causing her to have pain. So we say old man time, but it's probably time itself and the implications that the passage of time has. Anyone want to have a guess what the third one is? You're all on mute, so I won't have you answer. The third one is the Wheel of Fortune. The fact that all of a sudden bad luck happens. A motor vehicle accident, a flood, an electrical appliance causes a fire, your partner has an affair, all sorts of things that can be going on that are out of your control again, that are causing you to come to these painful places. I'm sure all of you will relate to one, two, or three of those particular things that impact on our capacity to maintain a sense of peace, joy, and love as a lifestyle. And of course, it would assume that the older we get, the more we're being exposed to those things in terms of the things that we experience. So purification and the dark night experience, these things bring us to the dark night of the soul, okay? And the dark night of the soul is literally when we're suffering as a result of loss of some form, loss of possessions, loss of relationship, loss of health and well-being. But when there's some form of loss and we're brought to that place of suffering as a result of the experience of loss. Now, there's two different types of dark nights. There's one called the dark night of the senses and another one called the dark night of the soul. The dark night of the senses is where people choose not to let go of their attachment to those things, and they put the energy into recreating it. And so what happens is they go back and they start all over again, and they get the new relationship, and they maybe get extra effort in making their body sort of the best that it can be. They might even tart it up a bit with a bit of surgery, plastic surgery and things, but they go through trying to recreate the illusion. And that's what we call when people go through the dark night of the senses. It hurts, but not enough for me to shift my framework of values. What I'm going to do is just work harder at trying to recreate it all again. You know that some people do that 3 or 4 times. They go back and do it all over again and again. What's interesting is that invariably each time it gets quicker, that they come back to the place where they experience the dark night of the soul. There is a point where, and this is what St. John of the Cross kind of alludes to, is that there's a point where we finally let go of trying to recreate all of that. And this is the process where we finally say, I don't want to be aligned with those values anymore. I want to be aligned with more sustainable values. The sort of values that keep us sort of distracted from moving into sustainable values are things like power, or avoiding victimhood, wealth, avoiding poverty, love, avoiding loneliness, success, avoiding failure. They're the 4 key things that we spend most of our energy focusing on, and the things that we've been programmed to believe are important. In order to make the shift through the dark night of the soul is actually a crisis of values, and it's about shifting and being aligned with a new set of values. And these are values that are about social justice. It's about forgiveness and mercy. It's about purity in heart. It's about being a peacemaker. And so all of a sudden, these are values that are about creating a quality of life that has peace, love, and joy as a sustainable experience. The work that we do, and the work that I do in terms of my mentoring and other stuff that I do, is that I help people, I guide people through the dark night of the soul experience. That incorporates things like becoming the observer, learning how to become the witness, and we're going to talk about some of this a little bit later on. The power for real change is in becoming the observer. And so we help you learn how to become the observer with an intention to love. Another step in that process is becoming teachable. It's about humility and being able to be available to hear what I call the still small voice. It's about all of a sudden getting rid of your 7-year-old, who most of us don't even know our 7-year-old is going the whole time trying to, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But instead of listening to the 7-year-old, we get to listen to the still small voice. Whatever you want to call that, the spirit of wisdom, the Holy Spirit, whatever you want to call that divine guidance. But all of a sudden, the fact that we can be attuned to being guided to learning about a set of values that are more sustainable, and then moving to the place where you're able to say, okay, this is what I'm up for moving forward. This is what I'm prepared to really now focus on as what I value and what I prioritize. And so the journey that I help walk you through is one that's about making those transformations and transitions. If any of you had a chance to read my work, you may, any of the stuff that's there, you may have read a bit about who I was, but I've been on that journey intimately, having been, some of you knew me when I was a very large man. I used to be 143 kg, and I'm certainly nearly 60 kg less than that these days. Substantial difference in terms of weight. But what went on with all of that was things like divorce and bankruptcy and depression. And I've scraped the bottom of the barrel, and I've been at that place of the dark night of the soul. And so I've been able to walk this journey. And the gift of all of that, and what I do want to say to you is that for all of you, that those places are in fact gold. They look like lead. Alchemy is the art of seeing lead and finding the gold in it. And what I realized in my own journey is that stuff was pure gold. And it became the leverage and the mechanism that I needed in order to be able to understand and fully appreciate this journey from a very personal and intimate level, so that, you know, when I work with people and they're talking about these things, I know it. I know it intimately. I've been there and had those things to deal with, and so it certainly was important in me creating and gathering the knowledge of this information to use it in a way that truly serves people. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is a little bit about why we get stuck in our human beingness and what's required for us to be able to move beyond that. Most of us don't think about being stuck in our human beingness, but given that a lot of you have done a significant amount of work, obviously, and have a strong interest in your spiritual awareness and development, some of what I'll be sharing with you may not be new knowledge, but the context of it may be helpful in terms of where we go with that. So let's have a look at some little bits and pieces. In the program that I developed, which is called the Centre for Western Mindfulness, we have a program called Pathways to Mindfulness. And it starts with a process that's called understanding consciousness. And I'm going to be sharing the first part of that with you tonight. This would be something that we would do in a mentoring program one-on-one with people, but it also works in a group situation. We've used it many times in that regards. And what I will say to you, and you'll get an email about this a little bit later on, is that there is a second part of this where you get to do a self-assessment on your current state of awareness in terms of who you are physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And there's an opportunity for you to do that with me one-on-one if you would care to follow that through. And that offer will come through to you at the end of tonight, where you can come on board with that and participate, as I said, one-on-one with me for a couple of hours as we sort of look at, and there's no charge for that, it's just part of the extension of what we're doing with you tonight, if that's something you want to continue to follow through with. And it has you look at where you're at in terms of how aware you are. Because at the end of the day, the difference between our capacity to move into soul being versus our capacity to stay in human being is our state of awareness. The less aware we are, the more we stay in our human being. The more aware we become, the more we have the capacity to move into our soul being. And so what we do is get you to have a look at your current state of awareness, which gives you an objective capacity. We have a lovely model of 60 statements that we use to help you self-assess your current state of awareness, and that will give you some idea of why you're experiencing what you're experiencing, if it's not everything that you want it to be. And it's a lovely tool. So what we have is a workbook that we use, and I'm going to screen share this with you as we go through here. So let me just do that with you now. So understanding consciousness is what we're going to be talking about tonight, and this is one of the workbooks that we have and part of the material that we use. One of the quotes at the beginning of it says, the critical mass of people needed to initiate social and cultural change is quite small, but to be a catalyst, they will need to understand how to make sustainable choices through living life with more awareness. Understanding consciousness. I don't know if many of you realise that, and hopefully some of you have come across Bruce Lipton's work and Joe Dispenza's work, but what most people don't realise is that 95% of the time we function in a subconscious state, unaware. For the majority of human beings, only 5% of their time is actually spent in a place of awareness. Now that's a scary thought, particularly if soul consciousness is equated to the 5%. If soul being is accessed through 5%, we can see why we have the issues that we have when the majority of human beings are functioning 95% of the time from a subconscious or not conscious state. It's a scary thought. And of course, what we're going to be doing is exploring how that happens. Science has taught us that when a baby's born, it's got all of these neurons, nerve cells, where it's designed to basically take in as much information as they possibly can. What's interesting is very quickly, the older we get, those nerve cells designed for taking information die off, and they end up becoming relatively quite small compared to what they do in those formative years. But literally, the brain is a sponge in little kids, and I'm sure all of you have had the delight of watching. Sometimes you're so caught up in parenting, you don't watch what goes on, but as a grandparent, you get to see the way in which children mimic Tegan, my daughter, has a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and talk about mimickers in terms of the things that they say and do that just really just show how much they're absorbing what's going on around them the whole time. And so what happens is we get programmed. Tell a story here about a young woman who's watching her mother preparing the roast. And just prior to placing the lamb of leg into the oven, her mum cuts the last 6 inches of the leg and bends it back as she places it into the tray. This intrigues the daughter as the tray is well and truly long enough to take the whole leg. So she asks her mother why she did it, to which the mother replied, "It's what your grandma always did." So in other words, she saw it happening from when she was a little kid. This is what she did. Curiosity got the better of her. She went and phoned her grandma to find out why she did it. On asking her, grandmother replied, "Oh, I did that so the lamb would fit into the baking tray, which had to be small enough to fit into my oven." And that's what happens is the mother developed a whole behavior just around that one thing as a result of watching what was going on in her formative years. Now, if you take that and extrapolate that to our whole existence in terms of who we be and how we behave, we begin to realize that so much of who we are and what we do is being dictated to by our programming. And so what happens is we move into a place of functioning on automatic pilot. So when it comes to this concept of conscious and subconscious, remember I said we function 5% consciously, 95% subconsciously. Conscious decisions, that's when we're aware, when we're present, have the capacity to take us in the direction of our hopes and dreams. Beneficial subconscious tendencies are when we learn certain habits so that we no longer have to think about them. For example, walking, driving the car. This saves a great deal of energy for our brain. Our subconscious, however, is mostly made up of habits that are not beneficial and can actually impact on the quality of life. And so we all have habitual things that we do that aren't always serving. Some of us have some of those beneficial ones. Consider for a moment how your life would be if you replaced your non-beneficial subconscious tendencies with more beneficial and conscious choices. Imagine if you could learn to replace negative thought patterns with more positive and self-honoring thoughts. You can see what I'm talking about here. Imagine how much less stress, worry, fear, anxiety there'd be if your choices were kinder to yourself, others, as well as the planet. So we're in this position where we do a lot of what we do because of the programming. I want to share a video with you right now. It only goes for 2 minutes. It's a brief one on conscious versus subconscious.
Our brain requires a great deal of energy to operate, particularly when we have to concentrate and think about something. Problem solving or making a decision not only uses more brain energy, it also can be a slow process. So our brain seeks to conserve energy by developing efficient ways of operating. One way it does this is through conscious and subconscious processing. Our brain seeks to automate much of what we do to save us time and brain energy. These are our brain's subconscious processes. They take care of our basic life functioning, our fight or flight response, and our learned behaviors and habits. We don't really think about these things. They just happen on autopilot or have become second nature. In fact, up to 95% of all our behaviors and reactions happen at the subconscious level. Our subconscious is also involved in the recording and storing of our experiences and knowledge, forming our memories. These are stored in our brain like photos in a picture album, which we can refer back to later. The way we think and feel about these experiences forms a frame around the photo. This is how we give people, objects, or events meaning. Over time, this is how our attitudes develop. For the most part, our subconscious processes help us navigate the world efficiently. Yet sometimes we might develop unhelpful habits or attitudes that prevent us from achieving our goals. This is where more conscious thinking can benefit us. Our conscious processing involves our higher thinking capacity, where we can be more mindful and considered in what we think, feel, and do. We can use conscious thinking to reprogram our subconscious and change our thoughts, attitudes, and habits. While thinking consciously takes more energy, it is how we take greater control of our brain and achieve our goals.
They're really Centus is a company that's Brisbane-based, I believe, and it may have expanded since we first got involved in accessing their videos. But you can go onto YouTube and revisit that anytime you want to. If you go to Centus, you'll be able to go and look at that again. There's so much in that in a very short period of time. But essentially, what was being promoted in that moment is this whole idea that we have the ability to function either at a conscious level or at a subconscious level. So what we're going to do is just do a little bit of an exercise here. Just take a moment to have a look at question 1, and I want you to list some of the conscious decisions you have made recently that aligned with the vision you have for your life. Any time that our choices basically foster a version of love, whether it be self-love, love of others, or love of the planet, then it's going to be inspired by as a soul choice, because that's the whole nature of the essence of soul is love. And so it's about making those choices inspired by being more self-loving, as opposed to the human choice, which is fear-based. So in other words, I spent years dieting, but my choices were fear-driven. And it wasn't until I started to make the choice to diet as a self-loving choice that it actually became sustainable. I kept on crashing and burning when I was being driven by fear. And that's the difference, is that when it's inspired by soul choice, which is a loving choice, then it's sustainable. And that's a really important difference to understand. Yeah. So how about the next one? List some of your beneficial habitual tendencies, something that you do habitually that actually serves you in a really positive way. All right. And then finally, we've got the third, and this is identifying the habits you possess that are not beneficial. State the activity and how it's impacting on you. My unhealthy habit, which I'm certainly much more conscious of managing than before, is I could be tempted to go to refined carbs. These days, I'm much more loving in my choice around that. But if I was to let go of my loving choice, I'd probably find myself easily going back into choosing refined carbs. So these are the sorts of things that that are getting in the way. And I'm sure while we've been talking, all of you are sitting there, and it's okay that you're not sharing, but I'm sure you've all thought of aspects of who you are in terms of making conscious choices, and how they compare to your beneficial subconscious behaviours, and how that compares to your non-beneficial subconscious behaviours. If we go back up and have a look at the screen here, non-beneficial habits, based on research, is 62% of how we spend our time. 62%. Beneficial habits, 33%. Conscious choices, only 5%. That's a fairly recognised collection of information. Okay, so understanding awareness and mindfulness. To live mindfully is to remember that you have a choice. You see, when you live habitually, which is your subconscious programming, you forfeit choice and thus the ability to be mindful. Choice means there is more than one way of doing or approaching things. This means that in order to be mindful of a choice, you would first have to possess more knowledge and understanding, meaning you would be more aware. This new awareness would include knowledge and understanding of alternative behaviours, thoughts and feelings that potentially would result in a more beneficial outcome. In the example below, the diagram on the left represents habitual behaviour with a typical outcome. The diagram on the right is the example of a scenario that could be the result of being more aware and mindful. So somebody who is less aware, in other words, has less knowledge around conscious eating, eats a lot of takeaway and processed food, and the outcome being overweight and facing health issues. We know that that's a major problem in our society because of, first of all, we have a whole culture of home delivery that never existed when I was a kid. Home delivery in my house was to have one of the boys, me and my brothers, ride up our push bikes to the local fish and chip on a Friday night and bring it home. That was home delivery when I grew up. And if we were lucky, you'd get that maybe once a month. And we know that in our society, there are major problems with overweight and health issues. A more self-loving choice is eating healthy foods that nourish my body. To know what's healthy and how to eat those foods and to take that holistic approach has a whole lot of knowledge that's needed in order for that to happen. And that then leads to this capacity to come to a place of an ideal weight and reduction of health issues. And I probably would be the perfect example in terms of how that looks, by virtue of the fact that I've been able to do it for myself in terms of my own health and well-being. So what do we do in order to develop new behaviours, how we shift our consciousness from habitual behaviours to conscious choices? And what we now know, based on the research that's been done in the science world, in the neuroscience world, is this concept of creating new neural pathways. In other words, habits are essentially nerve pathways in the brain that take us from point A to point B, and when repeated sufficiently, develops a program or a pathway that we will, with the right triggers, immediately respond to and go down that route every time those triggers are presented. And so there's this capacity to be able to develop new neural pathways. And in the context of what we're talking about, neural pathways that are love-centered, that are based on the idea of being self-loving, loving to other people, and loving to the planet. And so when we're able to start to get the understanding of developing neural pathways, it makes a huge difference. I'm going to just jump straight into another video from these people that we were using before.
Not so long ago, many scientists believed that the brain did not change after childhood, that it was hardwired and fixed by the time we became adults. But recent advances in only the last decade now tell us that this is simply not true. The brain can and does change throughout our lives. It is adaptable, like plastic. Hence, neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. How does neuroplasticity work? If you think of your brain as a dynamic, connected power grid, there are billions of pathways or roads lighting up every time you think, feel, or do something. Some of these roads are well traveled. These are our habits, our established ways of thinking, feeling, and doing. Every time we think in a certain way, practice a particular task, or feel a specific emotion, we strengthen this road. It becomes easier for our brains to travel this pathway. Say you think about something differently, learn a new task, or choose a different emotion. We start carving out a new road. If we keep traveling that road, our brains begin to use this pathway more, and this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway gets used less and less and weakens. This process of rewiring your brain by forming new connections and weakening old ones is neuroplasticity in action. The good news is that we all have the ability to learn and change by rewiring our brains. If you have ever changed a bad habit or thought about something differently, you have carved a new pathway in your brain and experienced neuroplasticity firsthand. With repeated and directed attention towards your desired change, you can rewire your brain.
Very powerful. And as a result of that understanding and the research that I've done over the years, I've developed a 5-step process that I have an acronym for, which is CHASM. And CHASM is the gap that exists between who we are now in our habitual behaviours and who we become in our more aware state. And I'm just going to share with you what those 5 principles or steps are. First is you can't change what you can't see, and so this is about exploring your current reality. So we start out when we work with people identifying what the reality is of their world now in terms of who they are in their state of awareness, who they are physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And so that way we get to know where you're functioning and how you're functioning in the moment. The nice thing is it's done without judgment. In terms of what we do, it's done with awareness. And the idea that here's an opportunity for us to, once again, as we move along, find the gold in the lead. We actually see that there's value in all of it. H stands for honouring yourself. And this has to do with a really important part of what was sort of touched on tonight, but it's fundamental, a big part of what we do in our Pathways to Mindfulness program, and that is learning what the narrative of your 7-year-old is. By the age of 7, and this is researched, you've established a belief system about your worth and a strategy for managing that is programmed into your consciousness in terms of how you behave. And it's the reason why so many people who do spiritual work keep on finding themselves having arguments with their partners, getting frustrated with their own inabilities, making poor choices that don't reflect loving choices, etc., etc. In spite of the fact they've done years of spiritual work, they still find themselves in difficult places. And I can tell you that the reason that happens is because your 7-year-old is taking control. And what we do is to help you identify the narrative of the 7-year-old. Because if you don't know what that is, you can't change it. If you don't know, and let me tell you, people go to their grave with their 7-year-old telling them how to live their lives. And so one of the things that we do is we have a lovely tool for helping you to identify your narrative. And of course, one of our principles of our program says that when something's observed, it changes. And the point at which you begin to observe the narrative, it starts to change. And reality starts to change. I can remember I had a lady that I worked with who was estranged, and I've shared this story with some of you that have done the course with me before, but she was estranged from her parents for over 7 years. They hadn't talked. And if they went to a family gathering, if they saw her in a room, they'd go somewhere else. They would avoid her and have nothing to do with her. She had a narrative, funnily enough, about believing that she felt that she had been adopted, that she didn't fit into the family, that she didn't belong. That was her 7-year-old narrative. Became aware of the narrative through doing the work with us and began to imagine what a reality would look like without it. Turns up to a cousin's engagement party, and she's sitting at a table talking to some of her family, cousins and that. Her mum and dad walk in the door. Their normal behaviour would be see her, go somewhere else. Walk in the door, they see her there, they come over and sit down and start talking to her as if nothing had happened in the last 7 years. They hadn't done any growth work. She hadn't talked to them about what she'd been doing. Nothing in terms of communication between them had changed. The only thing that changed was her finally being free of her narrative. I can tell you that you can do all the work that you want, but if your narrative has not been resolved, the wheels will come off and you'll keep on coming back to the narrative. Now, there's different ways of working with the narrative, but there's not many people that are doing it. And this is one that we found really does work and does make a difference. And I can say that it was when I had the aha about the narrative that actually my world changed. And that's when I started to lose weight. That's when I started to get healthy. When I began to understand the core essence of that. And that was literally as late as 2006, 2007, going on to 2009. And I really embraced it around 2010. And so what you see here is the product of the last 10 years, basically. But what was fundamental to my change was getting my narrative and understanding what was going on there. So that's H. A is exploring what an alternative reality would look like. What would my new destination be? You know, the yellow arrow, in that the old white arrow went one way and the yellow arrow in that little movie went the other way. What's my new yellow arrow destination? What do I want a loving reality to look like in terms of my world? What relationship would I like to have? What would I like my work to be? Etc., etc. S is what's the strategy that I would have to take to get from where I'm at to where I want to go? In other words, what would it look like? What would those steps be that take me from my current reality to that alternative loving reality? Here's the beauty or the unique thing about what we do is we actually don't ask you to implement any of the steps. All we ask you to do is to be aware of them, but don't implement them. Don't put any effort into doing it. Just be aware that that's the loving alternative. And that's how I can get there. And then finally, M is to be mindful and not willful. And that's what I was just saying then. M is about remembering that I have a choice. My definition of mindfulness is remembering in each moment that you have a choice to be kinder to yourself, to others, and to the planet. And I can tell you that as you start to develop the discipline of being mindful of the loving choice, you'll notice that I'm not saying being disciplined to engage the loving choice. All I'm saying is to be mindful, to remember that you have a choice. Then your reality begins to change. It's that simple, yet it's that hard. Because we're so programmed in our Christian Judeo culture, we have this no pain, no gain. You know, the only way you're going to get ahead is if you have to suffer. You've got to work hard. You've got to sweat blood in order for it to be different. And I'm saying, no, you don't. And excuse the French, as they say, but it's a real head fuck for people. The whole notion that just becoming aware with the intention to love is enough to change the reality. It's that powerful. Okay, so let's go back now to our little workbook. And I want to come to this last part here. And this part here is why we get stuck. Mindfulness is remembering in any moment that you have a choice of a more loving, self-loving and kind alternative. But to have a choice, there has to be awareness of an alternative to your current habitual behaviour with its outcomes. In the Buddhist approach to mindfulness, they teach three things prevent you from being mindful: ignorance, avoidance or aversion, and attachment. Buddha called them the three poisons because of their ability to cause sickness and disease, which he called suffering. By the way, those of you who have a Christian tradition, Jesus taught the same thing in the parable of the sower. In the parable of the sower, he talked about the seeds that fell on the road that was sealed and the birds would come along and eat it. That's ignorance. Then he talked about the seeds that fell amongst the rocks where the roots couldn't get established. That's avoidance. And then he talked about the seeds that fell amongst the weeds, which is attachment. He was teaching exactly the same three poisons. He just sort of packaged it in his parables, which a lot of them were farming parables. Buddha was a little bit more blunt and sort of saying, these things will kill you. They're poisons. So what's ignorance? Ignorance is when you don't know that you don't know, and you just keep on doing what you've always done. And of course, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. And let me tell you that the majority of the world is functioning from ignorance. Advertising is the adult form of programming. So we have our childhood programming, and then we have adult programming. All of the advertisements that you see on TV, all the advertisements you see all around you on Blink and your social media and all of those things, it's just bombarding you constantly with stuff that's about programming your thinking. And what happens is, in a state of ignorance, you just take that all on. You just take it on. The next one was avoidance. Avoidance. And avoidance is when you've been made aware that you need to change. And generally it does come as a consequence of having had some sort of minor dark night of the soul or dark night experience where you've had a bit of pain, a bit of suffering, and all of a sudden you've been made aware. How many people have been made aware about the health issues and don't do anything about it? And so what they do is they do exactly the same as what the person is who's ignorant, except they just have the knowledge. They're just in denial of changing the behaviour. So they keep on doing what they've always done, getting what they've always got. Nothing changes. The third poison is attachment. And so attachment of people who have been made aware and generally resort to willpower to change their behaviour. They go and see a coach. And please, I don't want to offend coaches, but many times coaches rely on willpower to change behaviour. And what happens is they do the diet, they're doing the exercise program, and they're really into it. And what happens is the wheels come off. They can't sustain it. A stressor happens in their life. And this is what happens is when we haven't developed the new neural pathway, what happens is when a stressor happens, we immediately go back into our old pattern. I'll tell you how easy this is to happen. As I said to you, sort of carbohydrates, refined carbohydrates, sugars and things, that's my weak area. So that's my old neural pathway. And after my mum passed away and we were making the funeral arrangements and that, I was here in Dalby, I was walking through through the grocery store, and without even thinking, an old neural pathway popped up, which was, I'm not feeling good, I'll go to carbs. And I picked up a packet of scorched almonds. Just like that. As my hand touched the scorched almonds, I then went, hang on a second, that's a habitual response. I could feel what was going on. I was out of my stillness, out of my peace place, human being behaviour. And I said, I have a choice here. In this moment, I can choose to pick this up or not. And we actually have a little tool called HAIL. And it's a great acronym that you can use as a safety measure. H is halt, and that's what I did. I stopped. I had the thing in my hand. What's the after effect? You've had lots of carbs before, and if you eat a whole packet of these, what's going to be the after effect? Well, for me now, blood sugar is going to be the after effect. Need to be really careful. L, what's the loving alternative? Well, I don't need carbs in order for me to feel good. That's the loving alternative. I can leave these here. Then we have something that's a bit of a head spin for people. The fourth one is, what's the easy option? In other words, we don't say, don't use willpower. In that moment, the easy option for me was to actually pick the packet up and buy them. That was the easy option. So I take them home and I'm about to open the packet and I do HAIL again. Halt. Before I open the packet, I'm going to stop and observe what's going on. What am I feeling? What am I about to do? What's going to be the after effect? If I do what I've always done, I'm going to impact on my blood sugar seriously in this moment. And I could develop a habit around it. Probably not, but certainly going to affect blood sugar. What's the loving alternative? Well, I could share this. I could have one or two. One or two is not a wrong thing, but eating a whole packet is. So the loving alternative would be to open this and share them around with everybody else. What's the easy option? In that moment, the easy option was to share them with everybody else. It took no willpower. There was no discipline involved in doing that. It was the loving choice in that moment. So being mindful is about remembering. And so we need things to help us remember, mantras. I have a mantra. My mum sent me a letter when I was a teenager, and in it she had a quote from Longfellow, and it's from a play called The New England Tragedies, and I'll share it with you. And this is my mantra. I learned this off by heart. So a mantra is a mind hook. It's when we start to go off and we need to be pulled back to our core place. My mantra, let us then labour for an inward stillness. An inward stillness and an inner healing, that perfect silence where the lips and the heart are still, and we no longer entertain our own imperfect thoughts and vain opinions. And God alone speaks in us, and we wait in singleness of heart that we may know his will, and in the silence of our spirits that we may do his will and do that only. And that became my mantra. That was the thing that I would use as a mind anchor when I felt myself being going off. So we teach you about mind anchors. We teach you about hail. We teach you about journaling and how to do journaling, and in a way that helps you to recenter, refocus, so that you are coming back to being mindful of the loving choice as a way of life. Here's what happens, is as you begin to apply these tools more and more, what happens, remember that metaphor I gave you of the dark clouds and the blue sky? What happens is those dark clouds start disappearing. And you begin to realize that what sits behind that is this blue sky. And instead of having occasional moments of feeling love, peace, and joy, what happens is you have blocks of feeling love, peace, and joy. And with the passage of time, what you get to a place of is where love, peace, and joy tends to be your modus operandi. In other words, blue sky is the way in which you live moment to moment. Now, the implications of that is that the quality of your relationships completely change, and the people who turn up in your world turn up differently. Or if they don't, if they're not ready, they disappear. And other people turn up who really reflect and are indicative of those qualities that you've really aligned with and have chosen to have. And of course, what we're now talking about is the fact that now you're choosing to live life as a soul being and no longer fully enmeshed in being a human being. So the five senses, in terms of sight, touch, taste, smell, sound, they become the tools of awareness. You use those. You know, it's no coincidence, once again, for those of you with a Christian background, one of probably my favourite Christian scriptures is in Matthew 13, where Jesus said, if you can see with your eyes and hear with your ears. So that's being the observer, using the human capacity to be the witness. And then he says, if you can see with your eyes, hear with your ears, and understand with your heart. In other words, have the intention to love. I will heal you. That's it. You know, it's interesting, the word health shares the same root as the words hello or hail, whole, and holy, which is a state of oneness. Your soul being is part of source, part of divine being, if you want to call it that. And that's when you come back to connecting with that. That's the healing. The word disease, dis means not, and the word ease means to be separate, to be or to be not next. It means to be beside or next to. So disease literally means to be not beside or not next to, which is a state of separation. So it makes sense that that scripture uses the word healing to describe what happens when you come to that place of being the observer with the intention to love. Remember, I used the word theosis right at the very beginning, and the definition of theosis is being the likeness of or being one with God, which is healing, based on what we just talked about. What I'm offering you in the course of the program that I'm doing and the work that we do with people is a journey of the first part of the journey of theosis, which is bringing you to that place where you make the commitment to having love be a way of life. In other words, that commitment to choosing soul being as what you want to turn up in the world as opposed to human being. Now, there's more to it than that, but that's the first one that really has to get you out of being stuck in human beingness. And really, the essence of what we're doing is taking you on that journey through being into that place of soul beingness. So where I want to go is what you would get to do with me if you come and have a free session with me in the invitation that you'll receive after this. And this is about going in and having a look at who you are in your current state of awareness. And we've got this lovely tool where you get to go through, this is the mental one, for example, where you get to go and assess whether, yes, I am engaged in some form of continuing education, yes, but or no. Usually I think before I speak. I meditate several times a week. I generally choose the company of uplifting people. So what we have is a series of 15 statements around who you are physically, 15 emotionally, 15 physically, and 15 spiritually, where you get to self-assess. And then we take you through those, and you'll get to do that with me one-on-one. Then we get to explore your results. We are actually able to see where your strengths and weaknesses are in that, and plot it on a graph. And then we get to give you an explanation. So we get to help you identify where you're sitting in terms of those things there. So it's a really lovely tool. We also have what we call 5 points of focus, which is about how committed are you in terms of personal development, self-nurturance, personal well-being, personal accountability, and social integration. And we have you get to identify where you are as it relates to those areas as well. So there you go. Thank you, everyone, for coming on board and being here tonight. If this has touched you and inspired you, please tell other people about, let people know about what we're doing. Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you for coming and joining us tonight. Much appreciated.